have our copies of copies, like Daniel Wallace said, maybe 20th generation copies. Because papyri are very fragile. The fact that we have anything is a miracle.
Yeah.
It really is, because these are, if you've ever seen papyri, it gets really, really brittle. So I'm going to just use the Gospel of Mark as our test case. We don't know exactly when the Gospel of Mark was written. We know Jesus died somewhere around 30 AD. We don't have an exact date. We know the destruction of Jerusalem is not talked about in the Gospel of Mark. Probably the most significant event in the ancient world. You probably would have included it, right? So we know somewhere between 30 and 70 has to be when Mark wrote his Gospel. We also kind of have a line in the sand where Paul goes on his first mission journey, somewhere around 44 or 46. Again, we don't have exact numbers. Well, we also know Luke met Paul on his first mission journey, right? And he wrote his Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. And we know the Acts of the Apostles comes after his Gospel because he says so in his book. We also know that Luke took a significant portion of the Gospel of Mark and incorporated it into his Gospel of Luke. So Mark has to have come before. But again, when? Well, another piece of history we know is the siege of Jerusalem started around 67 AD. Again, not mentioned in any of these documents. So again, that pushes us back.
Why do you think it wasn't mentioned?
Because it didn't happen yet?
Gotcha.
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people that will argue that.
Yeah, there's
when you start talking about like the book of Revelation, they'll say, well, it has to have been written after 100 AD. And there's doctrinal reasons why people want that to be. But there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem. And why wouldn't there be?
Right.
I mean, this is like the most significant event. Any Roman history from the same time period always mentions the destruction of Jerusalem. So why would we think the Bible writers wouldn't mention it in passing? I think it's really difficult to justify that perspective based on context.
Is the destruction written in the Bible at any point?
No. No.
the Old Testament when the
It's predicted. There's prophecies that predict the destruction, but not the historical destruction.
prediction.
But there are definitely predictions of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's different groups of Christians have different takes on those, okay? But the prophecies are definitely there.
No, my point is, when the Jerusalem was the destruction of Jerusalem in the Old Testament times, it was written in the Bible.
Oh, the Babylonian destruction, for sure. Yeah.
Means this happened after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It shouldn't happen.
Oh, okay. No, I know what you're saying, yeah. Because the earlier destruction of Jerusalem, the end of the first temple era with the Nebuchadnezzar was written. And it was, yeah. But the New Testament one, this is the Herodian temple, what they call the Second Temple era. There's just no record of it in our scripture. So it leads you to believe that it must not have happened yet. So we can kind of lead ourselves backwards, and we can get ourselves a ways, but how can we kind of put a date on it? Well, the death of Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, is not mentioned in any New Testament scripture. And we know they died somewhere between 61 and 65, the three of them. These are probably the three most significant apostles in the Bible. Most of the Bible is written by them.
This James is the brother of Jesus. It's not that James.
This is James, the brother of Jesus. James, the brother of John, died in the Bible. We have a record of that one. He was stabbed by Herod, right?
So why do we put Mark's gospel behind the first journey?
Now what?
Why do we put the Mark gospel behind
Luke?
behind the first journey of Paul?
We haven't got there yet.
Okay.
We will. I'm building the case. So again, we have history that's reasonably reliable from church fathers as far as when Paul, Peter, and James died. So we know that these have to have been before that. So the latest the book of Acts could have been written was probably somewhere between 57 and 60 AD. Okay, that's the latest number. Oops. Oh yeah. So the question is, how do we try to date these things further? Well, Paul gives us a glimpse in his letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy. Chapter 5, verse 18, he says, "For the scriptures say, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages." Well, the first part of this comes from Deuteronomy 25:4. It says, "Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain." Direct quote. You know where the second one comes from? Jesus. In Luke chapter 10, verse 7, "For the worker deserves his wages." So, Paul is referencing Scripture, and the Scripture he is referencing is Luke's Gospel. Let it sink in for a second. How did it become Scripture? Was it because Luke wrote it? Paul wouldn't have quoted something if it was just his opinion as Scripture. Luke's Gospel had to have been in circulation long enough and been accepted more widely enough by church leaders and probably the apostles themselves for Paul to call it Scripture. And you can kind of let your mind wander how many years that might have taken for the church as a whole to consider Luke's Gospel to be Scripture already when 1 Timothy is written, which we know is fairly early. So we know Luke's Gospel, the latest it could be is maybe 48, 53, somewhere in there, because Paul is quoting it somewhere around 53 to 57. People will argue about the dates, but you can see, you just kind of keep pushing it back, and you can see how now Mark's Gospel most likely was written before Paul went on his first mission journey. This is the same Mark that abandoned them on the trip. Yeah. But Mark was well involved with the apostles. I mean, I believe in his gospel he has a couple little personal touches that are only in his gospel. It's probably his personal experiences. You know, many say that it's Peter's version of the gospel that Mark wrote. It could be all the apostles for all we know, because Mark knew all the apostles. He was very well educated. He could have been the only one among them that could have written. He might have just scribed for them very early on. But how early? We're probably before Paul's gospel. What else do we know? Well, Matthew wrote a gospel in there somewhere. We know it comes before Luke because Luke uses some phrases from the Gospel of Matthew that aren't in Mark. So again, in order for Luke to even be able to have a copy of this, it has to be some years before. So 2 years is pretty minimal. So Matthew most likely is written maybe 45 to 50, which means Mark has to probably be 5 years earlier. Now you're within a decade of the death of Jesus. I mean, that in the ancient world, that's yesterday. So just by looking at what we have in the Bible, you can make a reasonable chain of custody argument that the Gospel of Mark was most likely written within 10 or 20 years of the death of Jesus in his teaching. That's really, really recent.
Luke did say, I interviewed people
that were still living, right?
This.
Yep. Well, and Paul makes reference to a lot of people having witnessed, like 500 of them witnessed the resurrection of Jesus and are still alive. So we know the time frame has to be really tight. Sometimes in our minds we think it's like spread out over time. This is from the death of Jesus to the death of Paul is one generation. It's 30 years. So it's not very long. And it takes a long time for documents to get circulated. It would take a lot more time for them to get altered beyond recognition. And the point is, you can trace it until you have many documents referencing the same material, not just one. So now you have redundant, consistent stories, which is a really good evidence of the reliability of the Bible. So
also the authors of the Bible, they wrote this, although it's God given, they don't have the personal agenda of why they wrote this.
Oh, yeah.
In our contemporary time, when you wrote something, it is more on your personal gaze. In fact, the apostles, they died for believing.
Well, actually writing these documents put a, they had a death sentence by the Jews. Yeah, to propagate this story was at the risk of your life. But the concept that the story of Jesus grew over time, the myth and legend argument you hear all the time, this makes that very difficult argument to support. You have a very consistent record covering a consistent period all the way back to the time of Jesus. You don't have enough time for myth and legend to arise. And for the myth and legend, they have to put out the Gospels being written way over here in the hundreds. If we can show this kind of evidence to someone with that argument, their argument kind of falls apart. So myth and legends, maybe not so much. So again, myth and legends grew over time? Probably not. Mistakes in the Bible? Well, Daniel Wallace talked about it. Yeah, there are a lot of scribal errors, but nothing changed in the message. I mean, nothing. The idea that I have to fast in order to cast out demons, okay, I'm going to fast just in case if I have to do it, okay? But I mean, does that change anything important? I mean, another common one is the book of Revelation. Some copies have the number of the beast 666, that's what's in our Bible. Well, about half the manuscripts have 616. Do we care? Does it change anything about how we serve Jesus, whether it's 616 or 666?
No.
There's actually a real good explanation for that, but I'll leave that for another time. Well, Greek and Hebrew. But that's a different audience. Well, it's numerology, right? So that's okay. So the next one really is, okay, did these documents change over time from the time of the apostles until we get to the councils? The councils kind of lock these documents kind of into history because now you have so much written quotation. So can we somehow watch the chain of custody that gets us from the time of Jesus all the way to, let's say, the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD. So we know John, I'm going to use the Gospel of John as my example. In Warner Wallace's book, he has a timeline similar to this for Peter and for Peter and Paul. But John lived somewhere between 6 and 100 AD. We don't know exactly when John died because he was exiled, right? But most people say this is roughly his time. So who did he know to pass on his knowledge to? Now we're not talking about written word here. We're talking about knowledge. Well, the Apostle John had some students that turned out to be pretty important in the early church. Polycarp, Ignatius, and Papias. These are very influential early church fathers. If you read any references to early church fathers, these are kind of, after the apostles, these are the three. And they were all students of the Apostle John. And they lived between 35 and 155 AD. So I guess that's about 50 years past John's lifetime with first-person knowledge of whatever John knew. Well, these three had a common student named Irenaeus, who lived from about 120 to 202 AD. And most of his writing, and these guys wrote a lot of letters. We actually have a lot of their letters. And they quoted the Bible a lot before there was a Bible. They were quoting these letters from Paul and the Gospels. There's like 1 million quotations from these early church fathers that is available to us today. So Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, Ignatius, and Papias, and he had a student named Hippolytus who gets us all the way to 236 AD. You can see how you can just kind of walk through the early church fathers and you can read the correspondence of each one of these guys and recognize that they are not only quoting the same scriptures, they're talking about the same topics, the same way. There's no change in any of the core tenets. And you can keep going all the way up to the councils with both John, Peter, and Paul, which are the main authors of the New Testament. So this idea that we can't track back consistently what's written in our Bible. And in fact, at each one of these points in history, they're talking about the same Bible that we have. And amazingly enough, we have the letters and the references to their letters. I mean, it's actually amazing how much scholarship we have in the Christian church. We don't know about it because we don't speak Greek. And all these would have been in Greek. But it's preserved for us. And in fact, Daniel Wallace makes a comment that I've always been taken by, is the fact, if you take these guys, and Origen and Justin Martyr and some of the other early church fathers, and you compiled their letters, he believes you could recreate the New Testament if we had no copies, because they quoted it so much. There would be enough quotations that would be redundant enough to prove that it was in the original manuscript, just from the early church fathers' letters and correspondence. So when they say, oh, we can't know what's really in the Bible, we can't know what was really written, it's like, okay, yeah, I can't say that, but I can tell you that what we read is the same thing these guys thought was in there. And they're pretty close. And in fact, at least Polycarp, Ignatius, and Papias probably saw the originals, or a near copy of the originals at least. So when we start talking about, do we know what the Bible said? Yeah, we kind of do. With great confidence, we can say that what we're reading is a consistent message, and we can track that same message back to the first century. So when they start talking about these slow creeps to the scribal changes, it doesn't hold up to evidence. And there is historical evidence to support that. Any questions? I mean, it's amazing. Was it Cold Case Christianity is where J. Warner Wallace builds these timelines. It's really, really nice.
The Duke admonishes them, to preserve the faith once delivered to the saints. And that's what they were doing. They were preserving the word of the eyewitnesses, and they just kept...
Well, and the reason it doesn't creep is the community of the Christians was unique in the time period. They spent time with each other on a daily, and they talked about this. They read these. Go ahead.
It's not like what they said right now. It's kind of this telephone game. It's not. They would say it to people, and people can verify what he's saying is true. It's not like one person just listening and then passing to another person and another person. No, it's passed to like a group of people, so it can correct itself. It's not the same as listening to somebody by yourself and passing.
Yeah, the telephone game's disingenuous, right? If you did the telephone game in a group of 20 people where everybody could hear each time that they spoke, it would be perfect when it gets to the other end, because you'd have all those people correcting the story at each step. Yeah, because when you have people that can check what's being said, then what's being said tends to be very consistent. And these cultures had oral tradition. Written word was not common for the normal people. Oral tradition is how they learned, it's how they knew. And that's what they would do. They sat around and listened to the story, and then they'd criticize anything that was wrong. So you were pretty accurate if you were going to be sharing these stories. And we can see that throughout history in oral cultures. they don't change over time.
And one of the psychologists that I listened to, he said that the brain of people that don't do right, that don't write, the way they retain information through oral tradition is totally different than people that write it and get information through like written language. Their brain processes it differently. So it's not like, oh, if you put yourself in that situation, you're gonna mess it up. It's like, no, that's the way they pass learning before. So the way their brain works is totally different. The way it's trained to work is different.
So just based on the stuff that we've shared, I mean, these objections really don't hold up to the evidence. I mean, under scrutiny. Again, you have to ask that person that's having a problem what specifically they're asking, and then you can show the evidence that addresses that specific question.